Thank you for joining us tonight for our continuing study of the book of Revelation. This is a study that is sponsored by the Citrus Park Church of Christ in Tampa, Florida, and we're glad that you're joining us tonight. We have been examining the Apocalypse for several weeks now, and today we're going to examine chapter 17. But before we look at chapter 17, let's just remind ourselves where we've been and looking back at chapter 16. Chapter 16 begins the description of the 7 bowls of wrath. And the book of Revelation, as we have been describing, has several series of sevens, including the 7 churches of Asia, to whom the book was first addressed in the first century. We have the 7 seals on the scroll, which was opened by the Lamb who was worthy to open the scroll and take off the seals. And with every seal that was removed, more descriptive revelation was given as to the meaning of what was going on in the things that would shortly come to take place. And then we had the 7 trumpets that were blown by the 7 angels. And now we're looking at 7 bowls of wrath coming down upon the earth dwellers. And the dichotomy between the 2 groups of people, which is very prevalent in apocalyptic literature, is that there are those that are good and those that are evil. Those that are heavenly dwellers and those that are earth dwellers, those that are God-fearers and those that ridicule even the idea of God, or at least the multiplicity of gods in terms of idolatry and polytheistic religion. And so chapter 16 begins, "Then I heard a loud voice from the temple telling the 7 angels, 'Go and pour out on the earth the 7 bowls of the wrath of God.' So the first angel went and poured his bowl on the earth, and foul and evil sores came upon the men who bore the mark of the beast and worshipped its image." This mark of the beast, as we look back in previous chapters, is the number 666, and it is reference to the emperor worship that was going on in the first century in the religion of Rome. And the economy was tied up in the customs and the traditions surrounding emperor worship, which was really brought to an extreme degree in the reign of Domitian. And we'll look more at some of the different kings and the Caesars in just a moment. If we drop down just a little bit with chapter 16 to get this context, I did want to make a mention about the Battle of Armageddon. And that's where chapter 16 and verse 12 comes in with the 6th angel. And so the 6th angel poured his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up, to prepare the way for the kings from the east. And I saw issuing from the mouth of the dragon, and from the mouth of the beast, and from the mouth of the false prophet, 3 foul spirits like frogs. For they are demonic spirits, performing signs, who go abroad to the kings of the whole world, to assemble them for battle on the great day of God Almighty. Lo, I am coming like a thief. Blessed is he who is awake, keeping his garments, that he may not go naked and be seen exposed." And so they assembled at the place which is called in Hebrew Armageddon. Now, when we think about this word Armageddon, I mentioned on Sunday morning in our Bible class that it is a composite of 2 Hebrew words, Har, which is the word for mountain, and Megiddon, which is a variation of Megiddo. And so if we look at Megiddo in the Old Testament, Har Megiddo is the mountain of Megiddo, which also includes the valley of Megiddo with the surrounding mountains and hills. And if we look through the Old Testament history of significant and important military battles, we find several battles that took place in this area of Megiddo, and I'll just mention a couple of them here. You might recall from our study of the book of Judges that the woman Jael takes a tent peg and hammers it into the head of Sisera, one of the Canaanite kings, and kills him. And of course, there are all kinds of songs and celebrations that are made because of the great courage and power of this woman Jael. In the book of Judges, chapter 5, and if we look at verse 18, it tells us that Zebulun and Naphtali were a people that jeopardized their lives unto the death of the high places of the field. And the kings came and fought. Then fought the kings of Canaan in Tanakh by the waters of Megiddo. There's the word Megiddo mentioned in verse 19. And they took no gain of money. They fought from heaven. The stars in their courses fought against Sisera. And so we have a mention here of this great decisive military battle in the days of the Judges. Perhaps the most famous decisive battle that took place in Megiddo is when Pharaoh Necho of Egypt killed King Josiah as he was heading toward Carchemish in that period of history. And of course, Josiah was one of the great good kings of Judah, but nevertheless, in this situation, it was a matter where he had decided to go against Egypt to his own destruction. And there's a couple of accounts that we could look at. There's an account in the 9th chapter of 2 Kings, and that's a parallel account, but I'd like to look at 2 Chronicles chapter 35, and we'll begin with about verse 16. And so in 2 Chronicles chapter 35, it tells us that all the service of the Lord was prepared the same day to keep the Passover and to offer burnt offerings upon the altar of the Lord, according to the commandment of King Josiah. And the children of Israel that were present kept the Passover at that time, and the great feast of unleavened bread 7 days. And there was no Passover like that kept in Israel from the days of Samuel the prophet, neither did all the kings of Israel keep such a Passover as Josiah had kept. And all the priests and all the Levites and all the Judah and Israel that were present, and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. In the 18th year of the reign of Josiah was this Passover kept. So we can see from this passage one of the reasons why Josiah is so revered in the Old Testament as one of the great kings of Judah. Nevertheless, here he meets his own end as we continue reading in verse 20 of 2 Chronicles chapter 35. After all this, when Josiah had prepared the temple, Necho, king of Egypt, came up to fight against Carchemish by the Euphrates, and Josiah went out against him. But he sent ambassadors to him, saying, What have I to do with thee, you king of Judah? I come not against you today, but against the house wherewith I have made war. For God commanded me to make haste. Forbear thee from meddling with God, who is with me, that he may destroy you not. Nevertheless, Josiah would not turn his face from him, but disguised himself that he might fight with him, and hearkened not unto the words of Necho from the mouth of God. And he came to fight in the valley of Megiddo. And the archers shot at King Josiah, and the king said to his servants, Have me away, for I am sorely wounded. And his servants therefore took him out of the chariot, and put him in the second chariot that he had standing by. And so they brought him to Jerusalem, where he died. And he was buried in one of the sepulchres of his fathers, and all Judah and Jerusalem mourned for King Josiah. The seventh angel poured his bowl into the air, And a loud voice came out of the temple from the throne, saying, "It is done." And there were flashes of lightning, voices, peals of thunder, and a great earthquake, such as has never been seen since men were on the earth. So great was that earthquake. And this great city was split into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell. And God remembered great Babylon, to make her drain the cup of the fury of his wrath. And every island fled away, and no mountains were to be found. And great hailstones, heavy as 100 weight, dropped on men from heaven, till men cursed God for the plague of hail. So fearful was that plague. And so that really gives us the description of the 7 bowls of wrath that come crashing down upon the ungodly people. And that brings us to this interesting description of chapter 17. Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot, who is seated upon many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and with the wine of whose fornication the dwellers on earth have become drunk." Now, chapter 17 is one of those passages that is very enigmatic in some ways, and yet sometimes not very clear in some ways. And I'll explain this as I go. We introduced at the beginning of our study on the book of Revelation that there are 4 major systems of interpretation of approaching the book. There is the continuous historical approach, there is the preterist approach, there is a futurist approach, and there is an idealist approach. And I also mentioned that there is also an eclectic approach that kind of mixes those 4 in different ways. So who is this harlot? Well, it depends, of course, on which system of interpretation you are adopting as you study the book. I think that the approach that we've been looking at is sort of an eclectic approach between a preterist and an idealist approach. And if you had to, when push comes to shove, if you had to ask me which particular approach would I take if I only had to take one approach, I probably would take an idealist approach, in that I want to find out what the big idea is in the book of Revelation. And the big idea is that good wins over evil, and that God's people will be victorious if they remain faithful unto God, no matter what the obstacle or tribulation might appear to be. And in this particular context, the tribulation was emperor worship in the 1st century. And this chapter is going to give us more details on that particular circumstance than perhaps anywhere else. And so we'll look at that in as we go through the text. So briefly, let's look at the 4 kinds of approaches. If you're taking a historical approach or a continuous historical approach, or as some of the commentaries call it, an historicist approach, then you're looking at the book of Revelation and the history of the church from the 1st century going forward, and you're looking at the history of the church, and the harlot is the Roman Catholic papal system. That is, that the entire Roman Catholic Church had become corrupt to such a degree that the papal system is described as this harlot or prostitute. The fall of Babylon, therefore, would be the overthrow of the papal system of religion and government. And for those who take this approach, this book is still yet to be fulfilled. It's the future still. And these chapters that we're reading from chapters 17 onward feature the divergent reactions of the godly and the ungodly in this final vindication of which is the true religion, and it certainly is not the papal system. The rider on the white horse represents the ongoing conquests of Christ through his word, or else his continuing campaign of judgment against other enemies. If we take a preterist approach, then Babylon and the harlot on this beast is identified with either Rome or with Jerusalem. And if it's Rome, then these chapters describe the downfall of the Roman Empire, and especially the city of Rome, which is the harlot. If, on the other hand, Babylon is Jerusalem, then these visions depict the burning of that city by the Romans and the mixed reactions of the wicked and the righteous. For those who are taking a futurist approach, and I've been mentioning a few of those kinds of expositors through our study, Babylon may represent the Catholic Church or some other great apostate religious entity, all the way under the Antichrist to the end times. Alternatively, Babylon may be a city, either a restoration of the ancient Babylon or maybe some kind of revived Rome. In either case, this great enemy of truth and righteousness will be destroyed in the end of the tribulation, to the chagrin of the wicked, but to the rejoicing of the righteous. Jesus visibly returns to earth in chapter 19, riding a white horse. For people taking an idealist approach, which I think has a lot of merit to it, Babylon represents the entire world system as a seducer of the godly, its worldliness personified as a harlot. Its destruction at the end of the age is depicted in terms of its current manifestation in the first century during John's own time, which was, of course, Rome. The ultimate judgment on this harlot comes through Christ at his second coming, who is the rider of the right horse, Jesus. Alternatively, the rider may represent Christ's more gradual conquest over the world system through the preaching of the gospel, and we become followers of Christ. As we continue reading in chapter 17, he carried me away in the Spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, which was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, and bedecked with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the impurities of her fornication. And on her forehead was written a name of mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of harlots and of earth's abominations. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. The city of Rome. What a tremendous ancient city Rome was. And I certainly recommend a visit sometime if you haven't had an opportunity to visit Rome. You see so many tremendous things there from the ancient world, including the great Colosseum. Of course, the architecture is interesting and impressive, and it certainly is an important landmark in the city of Rome, and it ties the ancient Roman city to the modern city because it's right in the middle of modern metropolitan Rome. But there is an attraction to great cities, and there's always money there, and there's the opportunity to be enamored with that and to be able to be impressed with that. So, of course, the city of Rome is represented by this attractive woman, but an attractive woman can be very deadly, as we understand so many passages in the book of Proverbs to describe, especially chapter 5 and chapter 7. And so Verse 5 tells us that on her forehead was written a name of mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of harlots and of earth's abominations. And as I mentioned just a moment ago with the previous slide, that the two principal interpretations among those who take a preterist approach is that Babylon the Great represents the city of Rome, or alternatively, it represents the city of Jerusalem. And this particular chapter, I think, gives us certain clues that really show, at least in my opinion, a preference for the city of Rome. Certainly, you can look at these verses and have your difference of opinion, and that's certainly fine. As far as I'm concerned, the main thing is the idea of it. Whether it's Rome or Jerusalem, it had caused great abomination to take place in either context. The woman was drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And so you think about the persecution in the city of Rome under Nero, and there was a certain bloodbath against Christians. And then when you look at the persecutions under Domitian later on at the end of the first century, there was even more extensive bloodshed of Christians, but not only limited to the city of Rome, but throughout the empire. And certainly much of that did take place still in Rome with all of the fierce power of the Roman government. When I saw her, I marveled greatly. But the angel said to me, Why marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast with the 7 heads and 10 horns that carries her. Now let me just pause here at verse 7 and mention that what John is writing in this passage gives us a clue. And the angel is revealing to John the mystery of the woman. He says, I'm going to give you the secret. I'm going to tell you the secret about who this woman is. And the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns that carries her, I'm going to tell you who that is, John. And so in verse 8, he starts to give that information, and also verse 9. So the beast that you saw was and is not, and is to ascend from the bottomless pit and go to perdition. And the dwellers on earth whose names have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world will marvel to behold the beast, because it was and is not and is to come. So again, let me pause here in verse 8. You have the earth dwellers, the people that are most impressed by this woman, this Babylon the Great. And they are impressed in this case because we find that there's something about this where this beast, and the beast, because it existed, and then it ceased to exist, and then it is to come again. And as we were talking before about the Nero redivivus myth, that you have Nero as a persecutor, and then he was not because he died. And then there is Domitian that comes back again as yet another more fierce Nero. And so that's one way to read verse 8, where you have this beast that it existed, and then it stopped to exist, and then is to come again. And then verse 9 gives us even more details when the text tells us that this calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are the 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. They are also 7 kings, 5 of whom have fallen. One is, the other has not yet come, and when he comes, he must remain only a little while. So I'll mention a few things here, but verse 9 of this chapter and verse 18 of this chapter are the 2 key verses, as far as I'm concerned, that give us details and clues as to who this woman is. And as I mentioned, we take this to be the city of Rome in the first century, during the time of extensive emperor worship and the persecution of people who refused to engage in emperor worship which would, of course, have been the Christians. And so in this passage, we want to ask the question, well, who are the 7 kings that are mentioned in this passage? And there's been a lot of speculation over the centuries as to who the 7 kings are and where we are to begin the series of kings. With which king or emperor should we place first? Would it be the very first one, Julius Caesar, who was a king, but not an emperor? It was Augustus who was the actual first emperor of Rome, also known by the name of Octavian. And then there are others who would suggest that the first king that we should identify here is Nero himself. That's in the context of this persecution against Christians in emperor worship. But really, the bottom line when we think about this is that no one really knows for sure. I think I have my convictions about who that is and who the first king is and all the series of the 7 kings and the context of it. But as we will see in the next slide, there have been a lot of different suggestions that were made over the years. Now, Craig Koester, who has written an extensive, up-to-date commentary on the book of Revelation from a scholarly perspective, I certainly don't recommend this commentary for the faint-hearted. It's 1,000 pages almost, and extensive reading. There's a lot of references to original languages and so forth. So it's a scholarly commentary, to be sure. And yet it has a lot of detailed information to those who are willing to be patient and study carefully some of the details of the text. There's a table, his first table that he presents in this book is focused on the 7 kings of the book of Revelation and then how that impacts the date of Revelation. And there are 6 basic interpretations or views that he presents, represented by the columns A, B, C, D, E, and F. And as you go from the left side of the table, we're looking at the kings of Rome that would go toward and support a pre-AD 70 date, so that scholars and commentaries and individuals who are taking an early date of the book of Revelation, that it was a composition before AD 70, such as AD 68 or 69, would look at these particular methods of interpretation, such as column A that starts with Julius Caesar. The second king would be Augustus. The third king would be Tiberius. The fourth king would be Caligula. Fifth one, Claudius. The sixth one, Nero, and so forth. And so you have that kind of systematic interpretation of the kings and who they are. If you go on the other side of the scale to section or column F, you would see that there are scholars such as Koester himself and Caird and Bruce Metzger and Homer Haley and Farrell Jenkins and many others that would take the approach that the first king would be identified with the first great persecutor of Christians, and that would be Nero. And then there would be the second king, Galba and Otho and Vitellius and Vespasian, and then Titus himself, who was involved in the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 as a general during the time of his father Vespasian's reign. And then after Vespasian, his father, passes, then Titus himself takes the throne. He is the 6th king, and then the 7th king would be Domitian. And so this would be the lining up or the correlation of the kings, depending on which system of interpretation you adopt. And sometimes you might change your system of interpretation based on the information that you are looking at when you're studying the book of Revelation itself. If we continue looking at the chapter 17, as for the beast that was and is not, It is an eighth, but belongs to the 7 and goes to perdition. And the 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received royal power, but they are to receive authority as kings for 1 hour, together with the beast. These are of one mind and give over their power and authority to the beast. And they make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those with him are called and chosen and faithful. And so when we're looking at these passages, as I mentioned in chapter 17, where the woman is sitting on the 7 hills and so forth, the 7 hills really identify Rome, because that was the way to describe the 7 hills of Rome. It also was a city that sat on many waters, as you have the city and the whole peninsula of Italy, modern Italy, surrounded by waters on every side. And so it fits that description. On the other hand, if we consider Jerusalem, if Jerusalem is this harlot sitting on many waters, there's really no way to think about Jerusalem sitting on many waters. Jerusalem is in the central mountain range of Palestine, and it is an entirely landlocked city. And so it doesn't really fit that description very well when you look at the description. And the main reason that I've mentioned this is because Rome was continuously described as the city which sits on 7 hills. And to compare it to modern United States symbolism in cities, as far as we're concerned, if I was to mention the Big Apple as referring to a city in the United States, what would come to your mind? Why, of course, we would think of New York City. Alternatively, if I were to describe the Windy City, what would come to your mind? The city of Chicago, my hometown, is called the Windy City. And there are reasons for that, of course, because it's off of Lake Michigan, and if you're walking in the downtown area, and certainly by the shore of Lake Michigan, you can sometimes have winds that would just almost take you off your feet. Another example would be Philadelphia, which is the city of brotherly love, and the city of angels. If I were to talk about that, of course, we would think about Los Angeles. And so sometimes cities take on a personality of its own, and the city that sits on 7 hills was the ancient city of Rome. Thank you for joining us tonight in our study of the book of Revelation, especially as we are looking at chapter 17. We've mentioned a lot of things that need reflection, and I hope that you will take the next few days to consider these things carefully. And when we come back in our study together on Sunday morning, we will continue to look at chapter 17 and then go into chapter 18, because we're coming down toward the home stretch, to use a metaphor, of getting down into the conclusion, the rapid conclusion of this particular 7th bowl of wrath and the Battle of Armageddon, and all that that entails, and what that means for God's people, and how are God's people going to fare in contrast with these earth dwellers that are facing this tremendous, wrathful judgment from God upon them. So the book is it causes us to think quite a bit about so many things. And the bottom line, and I want to just reiterate this an important point, that those who fear God and keep His commandments will be victorious, and they will overcome any trial, any tribulation, any ordeal or challenge that comes their way, even when it's coming from the source of a great, vicious, evil, and horrific dragon with a sea beast and earth beast accomplice, sometimes called a false prophet, and causing sometimes even sort of an attractive type of harlot in this situation to cause people to be seduced into the false religion of serving something other than Almighty God Himself. Thank you again for joining us, and it is my prayer that the study will be a blessing to you as you study not only this section of Scripture, but the entirety of God's Word.